Welcome to Learn the Word, the daily Bible teaching program of Calvary Chapel of Delta, and Pastor Doug McLean. Following Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 8 begins by showing Jesus' power to relieve human suffering. So let's join Pastor Doug in Matthew chapter 8.
Well, back in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 23, Matthew told us, Matthew 4:23, that Jesus went all about Galilee teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing all kinds of sicknesses and diseases among the people. And so that was a general outline of his ministry. And then in chapters 5 through 7, Matthew gave us an account of Jesus' teaching, recording his longest discourse in the Gospel of Matthew, commonly known as the Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 7 ended by telling us that people were astonished at Jesus' teaching. Specifically, what struck them is how he spoke with authority. If you look at what he said at the end of chapter 7, it's just the authority that he spoke with is amazing. I mean, he called himself Lord. He spoke as the Son of God. He spoke of his Father in heaven, so he's speaking as the Son of God. He spoke of himself as the one who will determine whether people get into the kingdom or not. You know, as many will say to me in that day. And so, amazing authority. And he concluded that section, he says, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them is like the man that built his house upon a rock. And you just think about the authority. To say that his word is so important that if you build your life on his word, you're going to endure through the storms of life. Bold claims. Now, as chapter 8 begins, Matthew reports on 3 specific healings that took place, miracles that confirmed Jesus' authority and pointed to his identity. And they were all in the context of relieving human suffering. He wasn't doing these miracles to put on a show, but rather he was showing compassion. So let's take a look at the text, chapter 8 and verse 1. It says, when Jesus had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And we're going to see in the context that he was heading back to Capernaum, which chapter 4 and verse 13 says that it had become his base of operations in Galilee. He came down the mountain towards Capernaum with just a huge crowd following. And then, as this happened, something so memorable took place that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all recorded what happened. Look at verse 2. And behold, a leper came and worshiped him. You may want to underline that. This leper worshiped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. First time in Matthew's gospel, we're given a specific account of an individual coming to Jesus seeking help. This man was a leper. Luke tells us in his account in Luke chapter 5 and verse 12 that this man was full of leprosy. Luke 5:12. So his leprosy had fully developed. It had spread all over, which means he was likely in the final stages of the development of his disease. Now, his arrival in this crowd would have caused quite a stir. A person that was full of leprosy would not be able to arrive unnoticed. Leprosy was considered one of the most terrible and feared diseases, and not only because of the tremendous physical suffering that came with it. We know that it started inwardly with pain, and then eventually sores would break out, oozing boils, ulcers, lesions. There would be serious neuropathy, numbness in the extremities, first fingers and toes. And so a leper would not be able to sense pain in those areas. Very common for a leper to have burns and other injuries and infections because lacking that sensation of pain in their extremities. It was very disfiguring, very repulsive, Lepers, their faces would swell, their skin would fold, their faces would end up looking kind of like lionish. They would at times lose ears, nose, fingers, toes. There's a lot of physical deformities with leprosy. They believe that leprosy was most likely what is called Hansen's disease today. Incurable in that day, certain slow death, certain death sentence associated with leprosy. Now, not only was it a horrible physical experience, but in addition, those that had leprosy were told to dwell outside of the camp away from the towns. In fact, they were to cover their mouths, and if anyone approached them, they were to cry out, "Unclean, unclean," warning people to not come near. Leviticus 13:45 tells us that. No one was to touch a leper. Leviticus 22:4-6 tells us that. Leviticus 22:4-6, for they were considered unclean and defiling. So serious a diagnosis, so life-changing, that there's an entire chapter, Leviticus 13, an entire chapter, 59 verses, dealing with how to recognize leprosy, how to diagnose leprosy correctly, because once you were diagnosed with leprosy, your whole life would change. Your life would never be the same. You would be taken from your village, you would be taken from your family, you were cast out from society, you either had to live alone or with other lepers, and you just slowly suffered and died without the comfort of family, without the comfort of friends. You were isolated. Numbers chapter 5, verses 1-4 points to that. As long as this condition continued, the person had no place in regular society. So you have the physical suffering, you have the separation and isolation that comes with it, and then the third thing is that most people in that day considered leprosy a curse from God. They considered it as a consequence of sin, God's punishment upon sinners. And they developed that idea because of three historic events. The first is Miriam, Moses' sister. Numbers chapter 12 tells the story. Miriam and Aaron were upset that Moses was the leader, and they thought it unfair. Why are you the guy? And they also were upset that he married an Ethiopian woman. And because of these two things, the Lord's anger was aroused, and the word says that Miriam became leprous. And Moses prayed for her, and God had mercy and took it away. But it was clear in the text, as you just read through the text, that it was a form of divine discipline in the case of Miriam. Secondly, is in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, you find King Uzziah, very successful, very blessed king, did so many good things, so prosperous in his reign, good for the people, but it went to his head. And he eventually came to the place where he decided that being king wasn't enough. So he wanted to be a priest. He wanted to burn incense as a priest. And as he tried to come in and burn incense, the priest stood against him and said, "You can't do that." And as he continued to do it, leprosy broke out on his forehead. And it was clearly divine discipline. He spent the rest of his life isolated from the community. And the third case is in 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5, Naaman the Syrian was healed from his leprosy through Elisha's ministry. And after he was healed, he tried to pay Elisha, and Elisha said, "No, I don't want anything from you." And Naaman started to go away. Well, Gehazi, Elisha's servant, chased down Naaman and said, "Oh, my master changed his mind. We just had these prophets come from a long way. They need some stuff." And Naaman believed him and gave him 2 talents of silver and 2 changes of garments. And Gehazi just pocketed that. And when he got back, Elisha confronted him about it, and Gehazi lied. And then, as discipline from the Lord, the leprosy of Naaman came upon Gehazi, and he was a leper the rest of his life. So 3 cases of history in Israel, we could look back and say, leprosy was a curse. Leprosy was divine judgment from God. And for those reasons, anytime in Jesus' day that you saw a leper, the thought that would come to mind would be, what did he do wrong? That there has to be some penalty this person is suffering. They're under a curse. They're under some discipline because of their sin. Add to that Isaiah the prophet, led by the Holy Spirit, in Isaiah chapter 1, verses 4 to 6, Isaiah 1, 4 to 6, used leprosy as a picture of sin and what it does. It begins below the surface. It creates inward pain. It manifests outwardly. People lose sensitivity when they're involved in sin. It spreads, sin isolates. So there's a lot of illustrations from leprosy that were true about what sin can do in your life, and then it slowly kills you. So that all stacked together made being a leper just a terrible thing. Now I have to say, listen, to say that leprosy was always a punishment for a person's specific sin was taking things way too far. Certainly all sickness and suffering has roots back in Adam's sin, way back in the garden. Before Adam's sin, there was no sickness, no death, no sorrow, no crying, no pain. But sin coming into the world brought sickness and death. And so you had this society where many thought, and by the way, even the disciples needed to be corrected about this. The disciples believed that any sickness had roots in sin. Remember John chapter 9, they came to Jesus and said about this blind guy, this guy born blind. They said, who sinned? Was it that guy or was it his parents? And Jesus said to them, no, neither. This man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God may be revealed in him. So in Jesus' day, many had this erroneous idea that if someone had leprosy, not only were they defiling, but they were also under God's curse for some specific sin in their lives. It wasn't true, but that's what they thought. And remember, Job, the whole book of Job, that's what you see for chapter after chapter. Job suffering physically and his friends showing up and saying, what'd you do wrong, Job? There's something you got to repent of. It's your fault, Job. And then God rebukes them. What are you guys talking about? You don't know what you're talking about. Now, I say all this to hopefully help you understand how difficult this man's situation was. Very difficult situation. And what it would have looked like for him to show up. Okay, we're told right away there's a multitude following Jesus, and then this leper shows up. And I have to tell you, you'd see him, you'd know him. And the crowds had to have just parted. It almost looked like the parting of the Red Sea. You see this leper coming down and just the crowds backing away. Where he came to Jesus. Now notice, as he came to Jesus, we're told he worshiped Jesus. So you want to underline that, mark that. I mean, you had the wise men. The first occurrence of somebody worshiping Jesus in Matthew's Gospel is the wise men coming to worship Jesus as the King of the Jews. The next time we have a discussion about worship is when Satan said to Jesus, if you bow down before me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. And remember what Jesus said to him? He said, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. Matthew chapter 4, verse 10. So Jesus clearly understood and taught that the only one you should worship is the Lord your God. And then the very next person to come and worship mentioned, is this leper worshiping Jesus. And Jesus didn't say, stand up, you should worship only the Lord your God. No, he accepted the worship. And not only did he worship him, but he called him Lord, which was at least acknowledging Jesus as the master, I think in the context acknowledging his divinity. And he says to Jesus, you have the ability to make me clean. So in his mind, he believed that Jesus could do for him what no one else could do, because there was no cure for leprosy. So it's an incredible statement of faith. You can make me clean. In his mind, He believed Jesus could if he wanted to. The only question in his mind is, was Jesus willing to do it? So the question was never in his mind, can you? But the question was, will you? And that's a valid question for today. Is there anything that's too hard for God? Not at all. I mean, we look around at the world, just looking at creation, we should be able to tell that the God, his capacity, his ability, his intellect is far superior to any of ours. What can he not do? Is there anything too hard for him? So in any given situation, the question isn't, can God do it, but what is his will? What is his will? Are you willing? If you're willing, you can. So here's this leper coming and expressing faith in Jesus' ability, and he expressed this idea that my healing depends completely on whether you're willing. And then in verse 3, Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Now, again, looking at the context, this is the first time in a long time that anybody touched this guy. Society considered him untouchable. You never want to touch him, you become defiled. You wanted to keep your distance from lepers. And Jesus here deliberately put out his hand and touched him. Now, question, did he have to touch him to heal him? No, we're going to see, and this is set in a context, we'll see in the very next account, that Jesus could heal at a distance. He could heal with a word. Now, Mark tells us in his account of this, in Mark chapter 1, verse 41, that Jesus was moved with compassion and touched him. So, although it wasn't necessary to touch him to heal him, it was necessary in God's plan to communicate something. See, he wanted to know this man to know that he was willing, that the leprosy which was keeping everybody else away wasn't keeping him away. I am willing, and he touched him. A few lessons in looking at this. Number one, God can heal you if you're sick. The question is never his ability. It's all about his will. If you're a believer, I can say with 100% confidence that ultimately he will heal you. It is a question not about whether or not he will, but it's always a question of timing for a believer. That's just reality. He may heal you immediately. He does at times. Or he may say to you, as he said to Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, 2 Corinthians 12:9, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. You know, Paul received grace in his infirmity, and he received his healing completely when he went to glory. And one day we know his body will be raised incorruptible. He'll have a glorified body. So, same is true for us. You know, ultimately, we're all going to die unless Christ comes back. We're all going to get sick of something and die. I hope that's not a shock to anybody. But if you're a believer in Christ, one day your body's going to be raised incorruptible. So you're healing, sure. Now, at times, God heals now. And for very much the same reasons that we'll see in our text today. So if you're a believer, the question is never his ability, it's always regarding his will. So you should ask and keep asking. When people say, how much should I pray for healing? I would say, ask until he says to you, my grace is sufficient for you, my strength is made perfect in weakness. You keep praying until the Lord shows you otherwise. Ask and keep asking. You may receive healing, but you'll receive grace either way. Second lesson for this is there are people today that have issues that society doesn't know how to solve. You know that. There are people that the best they do is just put them away somewhere. Send them away somewhere. Oh, you have that problem, we'll send you away. You have that problem, we'll send you away. You have that problem, we'll put you away. I don't have to fill in the details, you know. There are just some issues that nobody wants to touch with a 10-foot pole. And maybe you feel that way. Maybe you feel like a leper, like an outcast, injured, hurting, struggling. Listen, come to Jesus. He's not afraid to touch you. I think that's a very clear lesson here, that he will have compassion. Jesus said to this man, I am willing, be cleansed. Now, this is a little detail, but it's significant. He didn't say, God is willing, be cleansed. He said, I am willing. Again, speaking with authority. Then it happened. Immediately. Immediately, the wounds, the sores, his deformed face, any fingers, toes, appendages that were missing by this point, messed up nose, messed up ears, whatever he had, immediately it was cleansed. Everything was restored. And then verse 4 says, Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one. You didn't have to. You just look at him. You saw what happened. But he said, see that you tell no one. But go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them. So notice, healed and then given a mission immediately. A focus, something to do. And actually, the lawful way to be restored into fellowship. The procedure is found in Leviticus chapter 14. I would say this is a great chapter to read prayerfully, to come to Leviticus 14, say, show me Jesus, and read through it. It's an amazing chapter. Leviticus 13 says how you diagnose leprosy, how it's done by a priest, how it had to be a descendant of Aaron. And then you come to chapter 14 and you have the procedure, the ritual required for the leper who was cleansed to be restored into fellowship by the priest. So Jesus said, go to the priest, which means he had to travel from Galilee all the way down to Jerusalem. That's where the priests were. He had to send word and say, hey, here I am. I was cleansed from leprosy. By the way, it was a procedure for those who had been healed. It wasn't a procedure for healing, because there's no known cure. If you had been healed from leprosy, you were to go through this ritual that would affirm the healing, that would affirm the cleansing, that would restore the former leper into fellowship. It was a way that the priest would say to everyone, this guy has been cleansed. You can be around him. He can come to worship. He's been restored. Now, what's fascinating in looking at that is that after Miriam, we have no record of any leper from Israel ever being cleansed or ever being healed. Naaman the Syrian was healed. He was a Syrian. He wasn't under the law. In fact, Jesus would later say in Luke 4:27, he said, many lepers were in Israel at the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them were healed except Naaman the Syrian. So when this man in this chapter shows up at the temple, there would be quite a stir. The priests serving at Jesus' day definitely didn't have practice concerning this ritual. No one had ever carried it out. Read Leviticus 14. It's full of symbolism. It's very involved. It's an 8-day procedure. And it would have been a huge blessing to this man to have the priest involved in restoration of society, presenting him publicly, giving evidence of the miracle publicly, and no one could question then thereafter his healing or his restoration. So if you just look at what Jesus is doing, he's sending this leper to the priests to say, hey, I need this procedure done. And the priests were probably like, how do we do that again? I'm sure they had to get the scrolls out. And how did that happen? Oh, this guy named Jesus. So he was delivering a message to the priests, to Annas and Caiaphas. What a blessing to this former leper.
This has been part 1 of the message, He Can, But Will He? From Matthew 8. This message was recorded during the Sunday morning study through Matthew at Calvary Chapel of Delta. So if this teaching has ministered to you and you'd like to listen to more messages like this, or find out more about this ministry, you can find us online at calvarydelta.com. There you can watch services live, listen to Bible teaching, and find out about what the Lord is doing here in Delta, Pennsylvania. So again, our website is calvarydelta.com. That's calvarydelta.com. Now that brings us to the end of our time for today, but we're so glad you chose to join us to learn the Word.